Hello, everyone. Greetings to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good break this week and are a little bit rested, I trust. Maybe had a chance to do something fun. That would be good. And at the least, hope you had a chance to maybe catch up a little bit with some of the responsibilities and things. But as we get going this week, just wanted to share a few thoughts as we begin thinking about, because we're moving into thinking about pastoral practices. And so some of the specifics and some of the tasks before us. And so I've been trying to think in the first part here of the semester just about really theological foundations for the work of ministry and also leadership practices and kind of the leadership bearing, if you will. But we want to try to get into some of the practices of ministry and think about those carefully. So starting here this week, just trying to think about what I've called the essentials of pastoral practice. So what would those be? And we're going to start launching into, if you haven't already, the Willimon reading, in which that's really largely what he does. And in our forum questions for this week, I think I'm going to share with you a chapter again from my book that lays this foundation. But I want to say a few things about it just by way of kind of introduction to that. So we think about, basically what's a pastor about? What does it mean to be engaged in the work of ministry on a daily basis? What does a pastor actually do all day anyway? You sometimes get that question or joke from people like, wow, what a great job. You only work one day a week or something like that. Which, if that happens, if people say that to you, just go with it and say, just say, yeah, it's fantastic. And, just get to do whatever I want the rest of the days rather than get defensive about it or something like that. But we actually, in the Church of the Nazarene, for those of you who are Nazarenes and doing ministry as ordained or licensed clergy, we have a set of responsibilities that are handed to us in this regard, especially when we find ourselves in the role of pastor of a congregation. Manual paragraph 513 and following, which lists for us some 28 specific things that a pastor is to be responsible for and doing. Good news is about the first 6 of those are in the Bible. And so that leaves the rest of them that basically say, run the place. There's lots of administrative detail, lots of particular tasks that are given to the pastor. And this, I don't mean to denigrate those. Those are not unnecessary or bad even. But there is an ordering to them. In fact, a few years ago, I think maybe might have been the 2009 General Assembly, reordered those tasks to gather them as the core duties of the pastor, which lists the 6 or 8 things that are in Scripture, particularly, and then the balance of them under the administrative duties of the pastor. But that said, I do think it's instructive to look at that because it starts out, and the very first thing it says to us is the duties of the pastor is, number 1, to pray. Yeah, to pray. And then 2, second one is to preach the word. The third one is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The fourth one is to care for the people by pastoral visitation, which that's something along the way here I'd like to spend some time talking about. It seems to me that pastoral visitation has kind of fallen on hard times in our time for good reasons. I mean, just the nature of life these days, and it's very different than, certainly when I began and others as well. But nevertheless, visitation is a critical component. And then the other one, to administer the sacraments, and then to care for the people. I said that one. Those are, did I mention 5? To equip the saints, administer the sacraments, care for the people. So to pray, preach the word. Yeah, those are the first 5, I guess, that are listed there. Which seem obvious, right? In one way. And yet, I think most of us who've done this work would admit that sometimes it gets hard to keep track of those as first things first. There's so much that comes at us, so many relentless demands that come at us every single day, that it can be easy to get off track and let the core things, the first things, kind of take a secondary position. So one of the things, to go back to Eugene Peterson again, because I'm going to talk about his model of this here in a minute. One of the things he helped me to understand was that or helped me to admit that one of the reasons that I was doing that is out of really my own anxiety, that I wanted to demonstrate to my people that, I was on the job. They didn't have to worry. I'm, earning the salary they were paying me, all that good stuff. So, but it was born out of my own anxiety, sometimes even more that than what they were the expectations that they were trying to lay on me. So, and I may have mentioned this to you before. I can't remember in the other recordings whether I alluded to this or not, but it bears repeating anyway, so I'm going to say it again. And you probably, some of you might be very, very familiar with this. But one of the models that Peterson has given to us that I think is very helpful at this point of trying to think about what pastoral practices are truly essential is what he puts under the language of working the angles. He has a book by that title from some years ago. And the basic idea is, he said, think about a triangle. And when we look at a triangle, what we tend to see are the lines. But what really gives shape to it are the angles. And he said, just using that model, think about pastoral ministry. What we tend to see, what we tend to notice first, are the public acts of preaching, teaching, administration, and many of the things that are listed in that manual statement of the 28 duties of the pastor. But, he says, what really gives shape to and faithful shape to pastoral ministry are the angles that he identifies as prayer, study of the scriptures, and then what he calls spiritual direction. And what he means by that is what I have come to call listening. Listening to God, listening to others in ways that become life-giving and healing and faithful in terms of the relationships that we're called to share together as the people of God. And so the question gets to be, how does one order one's life in such a way that those things really do take first place? As Brueggemann has said to us, pastors, we so often get to the sermon, for example, out of our exhaustion. And I suspect that could be said about any of those. That in terms of prayer, how and where does that sit as first in the way we go about the work of ministry, the way we order our days? And it's so easy, I know, for probably a lot of us to begin today rushing into the tasks that are before us. And there's so much in the world in which we're experiencing it in these days, and culture in which we're experiencing it these days, that pull us and press us away from practices of prayerfulness. And I'm not here just talking about and thinking about devotional prayer, although that certainly is in there, very, very critically in there. But really thinking in some ways about a way of being. D. Freeborn, who used to teach at seminary many years ago, talked about prayer as going everywhere with Jesus. But that's a posture, that's a life that has to be nurtured. And it has to be nurtured in quiet places and solitary places. And so those moments become very critical to us. In terms of study of the scriptures, obviously that takes a lot of time. And it seems to me that there is, because of the amount of content knowledge that we have at our fingertips, it's so easy to rush to the resources that we have at our fingertips to try to put together a structure and a content for preaching and teaching and other things. That the danger of that is it can obscure the first task in that regard of sitting with Scripture, of soaking in the text, of lingering and listening to it. And then the idea of listening or spiritual direction. And I've come to think about it again as listening, both listening to God, which connects to prayer, obviously, and Scripture study, but then especially listening to others. So being with others in those tasks and being with others out of those tasks. And pastoral visitation has an awful lot to do with that. Again, to reach to Peterson, one of the things that he gave me was this idea of the ability to be unhurried in the presence of another person. And I thought about that a lot. I continue to, but especially thought about that in the pastoral work of being with people when they would come to see me or I would go to see them. And one of the temptations that I dealt with was, especially when people would come to my study to see me there. And I had chairs and a table and a space arranged, for casual conversation, to be able to sit and across from one another and have conversation. But the temptation was I was constantly thinking about what was over there on the desk that was screaming for my attention. And so sometimes sitting there, I would quite literally pray, Lord, help me to be unhurried in the presence of this person and to listen well. And the Lord, by the Spirit, helped me with that and helped me to learn that in some deeper ways. So this has everything to do with, if I'm going to give first attention to these angles, as Peterson calls them, of prayer, study the Scriptures, and spiritual direction, that takes a lot of intentionality. Peterson said once, maybe wrote it, I found it took a lot of time to be a pastor. And he wasn't talking about the work of it so much. He was talking about these things. And it's true. And so the discipline of trying to guard spaces and time for these things to happen best for us. And I know I'm talking to folk who are doing that in the midst of sometimes co-vocational ministries, in the midst of raising children, in the midst of, just so many life activities and responsibilities coming at us all the time that it's a huge task. But in the questions that I'll provide for you for our forum conversations, I'd just like to invite us to reflect on these things a little bit and try to think about what are the disciplines, what are the tools, what are the ways that we can even help one another as colleagues in ministry to keep first things first, to work the angles, and to not just get overrun by the demands, the expectations of ministry. One of the things that I do think in all of this that we have to become ruthlessly honest about is what it is that actually takes our time. We love to talk about being so busy, but sometimes I think we get busy with very secondary things. And I think we just have to get very, very honest about that. So anyway, just some introductory thoughts, and I'll provide you with this book chapter that goes into this more, and then invite us to reflect with some questions this week. Hope everything else is going well. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Shoot me a message, email, whatever, and we'll try to respond to those. And look forward to the continued conversation. Have a good week.